The Rocky Mountains held their breath that December morning. Snow had fallen through the night, painting the world in shades of white and gray, and now the clouds hung low over the peaks like a burial shroud waiting to descend. The only sound was the steady crunch of hooves breaking through the frozen crust of earth and the labored breathing of a horse that had traveled too far on too little rest. Garrett Holloway rode alone. He was 33 years old, though the gray threading through his dark hair and the deep lines carved around his eyes told a story of a man who had lived twice that. His jaw was covered in several days' worth of stubble, and his clothes carried the dust of 100 miles. A Colt Peacemaker hung at his hip, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and a Winchester rifle rested in the saddle scabbard. He rode with the easy posture of a man accustomed to long journeys, but there was something hollow in the way he moved, something empty. In the pocket of his weathered leather coat, a folded piece of paper pressed against his chest, the deed to a cabin he had never wanted, an inheritance from a man he had barely known, the last connection to a family that had crumbled to dust 3 years ago on a night he could not stop reliving, no matter how much whiskey he poured down his throat. Garrett's horse, a black stallion named Midnight, snorted and tossed his head as they crested the final ridge. Below them, a valley opened up like a wound in the mountainside. Pine trees lined the slopes, their branches heavy with snow. A frozen creek wound through the center, its surface glinting like broken glass in the pale morning light. And there, nestled against the far slope where the forest met a broad meadow, sat the cabin. Eagle Ridge. The last time Garrett had seen this place, he was 12 years old. His father had brought him here to visit Uncle Silas during the summer of 18s. He remembered fishing in that creek. Remembered the old man teaching him to shoot to track deer, to read the weather in the clouds. He remembered thinking that Silas Holloway was the loneliest person he had ever met living up here, with nothing but the wind and the wolves for company. Now Garrett understood that loneliness, understood it like a man understands the shape of his own bones. The lawyer in Denver had been very specific. Silas Holloway died of heart failure 3 months ago. The cabin had been empty ever since. The property was to pass to his only living relative, Garrett Holloway. Free and clear, no complications. So why was smoke rising from the chimney? Garrett pulled Midnight to a halt, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the butt of his revolver. His eyes gray as the winter sky and just as cold swept across the scene below. 5 horses grazed in the meadow, their coats thick with winter fur. Firewood was stacked neatly against the cabin wall, and through the windows he could see movement, shadows dancing in the warm glow of lamplight. Someone was living in his cabin. The thought should have sparked anger. It sparked nothing. 3 years of feeling nothing had left Garrett's heart as frozen as the landscape around him. He had come here to be alone, to wait out whatever remained of his life in silence and solitude far from the memories that haunted him. If squatters had taken up residence, he would deal with them, one way or another. He urged Midnight forward, beginning the descent into the valley. As he drew closer, the sounds of the cabin reached him. Voices, female voices, light and musical, punctuated by laughter. The clatter of dishes, the scrape of chairs across wooden floors. These were not the sounds of outlaws or drifters. These were the sounds of domesticity, of home. Garrett dismounted at the edge of the meadow, looping Midnight's reins around a fence post that had not existed 20 years ago. Someone had built a proper corral here. Someone had maintained the property with care. He studied the cabin as he approached, noting the repairs to the roof, the fresh coat of paint on the shutters, the flower box that would bloom with color come spring. This was not abandonment. This was occupation. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as he climbed the 3 steps to the wooden porch. The laughter inside fell silent. He heard whispered voices, footsteps, the subtle click of a gun being cocked. Good. They were cautious. That was smart. Garrett knocked 3 times, the sound sharp and decisive in the mountain air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door swung open and Garrett Holloway forgot how to breathe. She was tall, perhaps 5'8", with black hair that cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall at midnight. Her eyes were green, not the pale green of spring leaves, but the deep dark green of forest shadows, of hidden depths, of secrets kept for too long. She wore a simple blue dress that did nothing to hide the elegant lines of her figure, and she stood with a posture that spoke of breeding, of education, of a woman who had been raised to command attention without demanding it. She was without question the most beautiful woman Garrett had ever seen. Behind her, 4 other women had arranged themselves around the cabin's main room. A redhead with fierce blue eyes stood near the window, her hand hidden in the folds of her skirt in a way that told Garrett exactly where she kept her weapon. A small blonde with delicate features peered around the doorframe of what appeared to be the kitchen, her face a mixture of curiosity and fear. A brunette with calculating, dark eyes remained in the shadows near the fireplace, watching him with the stillness of a snake, deciding whether to strike. And an older woman with auburn hair and an air of quiet authority stood near a writing desk, one hand resting on a stack of papers. 5 women, 5 horses, 5 pairs of eyes studying him with varying degrees of suspicion and hostility. Garrett found his voice. "I am Garrett Holloway." The words came out rough, scraped raw by months of disuse. "This cabin belongs to me now. My uncle Silas Holloway left it to me in his will." He held up the deed, the official seal clearly visible on the weathered parchment. The dark-haired woman at the door did not even glance at it. Instead, her green eyes remained fixed on his face, searching for something he could not name. "I am Eleanor Blackwood," she said. Her voice was low and melodic, carrying an undertone of authority that made something tighten in Garrett's chest. "Please come inside. We need to talk." She stepped aside with fluid grace, gesturing for him to enter. And despite every instinct screaming at him to be cautious, Garrett crossed the threshold into the warmth of his uncle's cabin. The interior had been transformed since his childhood visits. Rich fabrics draped the windows, filtering the pale winter light into soft gold. Elegant furniture filled the rooms, pieces that spoke of taste and money and careful selection. The scent of lavender and wood polish hung in the air, mixed with the rich aroma of coffee brewing and bread baking. These women had made this place their home. They had done so with care, with permanence. "Why, ma'am?" The redhead stepped forward, first her posture aggressive, her blue eyes blazing with defiance. "I am Rosalie Brennan. Before you start making demands, you should know we have every right to be here." Her voice was sharp-edged with an anger that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. "We are not leaving." The small blonde moved closer, her gentle demeanor contrasting sharply with Rosalie's hostility. "I am Lily Ashford. We do not want trouble. Truly we do not." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and Garrett felt an unexpected urge to reassure her. To tell her that everything would be all right, even though he had no idea if it would be. The brunette in the shadows finally stepped into the light, and Garrett was struck by the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. She moved like someone who spent her life calculating odds, measuring risks, preparing for betrayals. "Vivian Crane," she said simply. Nothing more. No explanation. No apology. The auburn-haired woman approached from the writing desk, a folded piece of paper in her hands. She was older than the others, perhaps 35, and she carried herself with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to manage crises. "Margaret Sullivan. Most people call me Maggie." She extended the paper toward Garrett. "We have been expecting you, Mr. Holloway, though perhaps not quite so soon." Garrett took the paper, unfolding it carefully. His heart sank as he read the contents. It was a contract dated 3 months ago, bearing a signature he would have recognized anywhere. The same scrawling handwriting that had marked birthday cards and letters throughout his childhood. Silas Holloway, his uncle, had signed an agreement granting these 5 women residence rights to the property for as long as they needed it in exchange for maintaining the cabin and surrounding land. "This is impossible," Garrett said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The lawyer never mentioned any existing agreements. He told me the property was mine free and clear." Rosalie moved closer, her presence radiating a heat that made Garrett acutely aware of how small the cabin felt, with all 6 of them inside. "Lawyers do not always know everything, do they?" Her words carried a suggestion that made his pulse quicken, though he could not quite grasp what she was implying. "Sometimes old men keep secrets, even from their families." Eleanor circled him slowly like a predator evaluating prey, yet there was something almost protective in her movement. When she stopped directly in front of him, Garrett caught his breath. She was close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Close enough that the warmth from her body seemed to envelop him like a blanket. "The question is not whether you own this cabin, Garrett." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly through the silent room. "The question is whether you can handle what comes with it." She paused, her lips curving into a smile that was both invitation and challenge. "Can you handle all 5 of us? The words hung in the air between them like a dare. And Garrett realized that whatever he had expected to find in this remote mountain cabin, it was not this. These women were not simply squatters or trespassers. They were something else entirely. And the way Eleanor was looking at him suggested that his quiet life was about to become anything but peaceful. Before he could respond, his eyes caught something on the floor near the fireplace, a dark stain on the wooden boards. Old blood scrubbed hard but impossible to completely remove. And on the wall opposite, a small hole that had been hastily filled with wood of a slightly different shade. A bullet hole. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What is that?" Garrett's voice had changed. The hollow emptiness was gone, replaced by something harder. Something that remembered what it was to wear a badge, to investigate, to demand answers. The women exchanged quick glances. A silent communication passed between them, and Garrett saw fear flicker across Lily's delicate features, saw Rosalie's hand tighten around whatever weapon she had hidden in her skirt, saw Vivian retreat further into the shadows. It was Maggie who finally spoke. "Mr. Silas did not pass away peacefully, Mr. Holloway." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the weight of grief beneath it. The lawyer's story about heart failure was convenient, but it was not the truth. Garrett felt his body tense. "The lawyer said my uncle died in his sleep, natural causes, no complications." "That is what they wanted everyone to believe," Vivian said from the shadows, her voice cold as the winter wind outside. "The truth is considerably more complicated." Eleanor placed her hand on Garrett's arm. It was the first time they had touched, and he felt something like electricity arc between them. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin, and when their eyes met, he saw not just caution in her gaze, but something that might have been hope. "There is much you need to know, Garrett Holloway. About your uncle, about us, about the men who will come looking for us." She paused, her grip tightening slightly. "But first you need to decide. Whose side are you on?" The story came out in pieces, each woman contributing fragments to a larger picture that grew darker with every revelation. Silas Holloway had not been simply a hermit living out his final years in mountain isolation. He had been a former judge in Denver, one of the few honest men in a system riddled with corruption. And he had made a powerful enemy, Nathaniel Blackburn. The name meant nothing to Garrett, but as Maggie described the man, a portrait emerged of calculated evil. Blackburn owned the largest mining operation in the territory. He sat on the territorial council. He had judges in his pocket, sheriffs on his payroll, and politicians who jumped when he snapped his fingers. But his legitimate business was merely a facade for something far more sinister. Blackburn ran a network of human trafficking, using fraudulent labor contracts to enslave women. He targeted the vulnerable, the desperate, the ones with no family to ask questions when they disappeared. He operated boarding houses that were little more than brothels and worked women to death in his mines under conditions that would have shocked a medieval dungeon master. For 2 years, Silas Holloway had been building a case against him, gathering evidence, creating a network of safe houses to help women escape. The cabin at Eagle Ridge was the final stop on an underground railroad that had helped more than 20 women start new lives in California and Oregon. 3 months ago, Blackburn discovered the network. 4 men came in the night. Eleanor said, her voice flat, but her eyes burning with remembered horror. They were not expecting resistance. Your uncle was 70 years old. They thought he would be easy. Rosalie's laugh was bitter. They were wrong. The attack had been swift and brutal. The 4 men burst through the door, expecting to find helpless women. Instead, they found Silas Holloway with a shotgun and a lifetime of frontier justice behind him. He killed 2 of them before they got close enough to wound him. "We drove the others off," Maggie continued, her medical training evident in the clinical detachment of her words. "But your uncle was badly hurt. We could not take him to a doctor in town. Blackburn has people watching everywhere. His men would have finished what they started. I did everything I could." The pain in Maggie's voice was raw. The wound was too severe, too much blood loss. He lived for 3 days, long enough to sign the contract giving us the right to stay here, long enough to write a letter. She withdrew a sealed envelope from the desk drawer and handed it to Garrett. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. The handwriting was shaky, the letters formed by a hand that was losing strength with every word. But it was unmistakably his uncle's voice that spoke from the page. My dear Garrett, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come to Eagle Ridge as I hoped you would. There is so much I never told you, so many secrets I kept to protect you. I am sorry for that now. Nathaniel Blackburn is not merely my enemy. He is yours as well. I did not understand the connection until recently, but now I am certain. The evil that touched your life 3 years ago did not come from where you think. Ask Eleanor about the night in Dodge City. Ask her what really happened to Sarah. I am sorry, Garrett. I should have told you sooner. These women need protection. They carry evidence that can bring Blackburn to justice. But more than that, they need someone to believe in them. Someone to fight for them when the world has told them they are worthless. Be that person, Garrett. Not because I ask it of you, but because it is who you were meant to be. Keep them safe. And perhaps in doing so, you will find what you lost. With love and regret, Uncle Silas P.S. The answer to your question, the one you have carried for 3 years, is in Blackburn's hands. Find it, and find peace. Garrett read the letter twice. Then a third time, the words blurred together as something long frozen inside him began to crack. Sarah, his wife, the school teacher with the golden hair and the warm smile who had believed in him when no one else did, who had given him a daughter with blue eyes like spring skies, who had been murdered 3 years ago by the McCready brothers, killed in retaliation for Garrett's pursuit of their gang. Or so he had believed. He looked up from the letter, his gray eyes finding Eleanor's green ones. What happened in Dodge City? His voice was barely a whisper. What does my uncle mean about my wife? Eleanor's face went pale. The other women fell silent, the tension in the room sharp enough to cut. That is a conversation for another time, Mr. Holloway. Eleanor's voice was careful, measured. When we know you better. When we know if we can trust you. My wife is dead. The words came out harder than he intended. She has been dead for 3 years. If you know something about how she died, you will tell me. Now. Eleanor held his gaze without flinching. I will tell you everything, I promise, but not today. Not until we are certain which side you are on. Before Garrett could press further, a sound from outside froze everyone in place. Hoofbeats, approaching fast. Rosalie was at the window in an instant, her hand finally revealing the small pistol she had kept hidden. They found us. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. 3 riders, coming up from the valley. Garrett moved to look over her shoulder. Through the gap in the curtains, he saw them. 3 horsemen emerging from the tree line, their dark clothing making them stand out against the snow-covered landscape. Even from this distance, he could see they rode like men accustomed to violence. Their hands rested casually on their weapons, and their eyes swept the property with predatory interest. The man in the lead was tall, perhaps 54 years old, with silver-gray hair, swept back from a high forehead, and pale eyes that seemed to reflect no warmth whatsoever. He wore an expensive black coat that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. Blackburn, Vivian whispered from the shadows, and the name dripped with hatred. Eleanor grabbed Garrett's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Stay away from the window, she breathed, her lips close to his ear. He cannot know you are here, not yet. The riders stopped near the corral. Garrett watched as the man in the expensive coat dismounted with practiced ease. His 2 companions remained on their horses, one a massive brute with a scar running across his face, the other a thin man with the twitchy eyes of a rat. Blackburn climbed the porch steps, slowly, deliberately savoring the moment. His knock on the door was measured, calm. The knock of a man who knew he held all the power in whatever conversation was about to follow. Garrett felt something he had not felt in 3 years. Not anger exactly, something older, something more primal. The instinct of a hunter who has finally caught the scent of his prey. What do we do? Lily whispered, her voice trembling. We answer the door, Eleanor said. Her face had transformed. Gone was the vulnerable woman who had avoided Garrett's questions about Sarah. In her place stood someone harder, someone who had learned to survive. We have played this game before. We know how it ends. In him, Rosalie jerked her chin toward Garrett. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then, without warning, she reached into a cabinet and withdrew an old revolver. She pressed it into Garrett's hands. That belonged to your uncle, she said softly. He would want you to have it. The weight of the gun was familiar, comforting. It was a Smith& Wesson Model 3, well-maintained, but clearly old. Garrett checked the cylinder. Fully loaded. "Stay in the back room," Eleanor instructed. "Listen, learn who we are dealing with, and when this is over, decide if you are willing to fight for something again." She held his gaze for one long moment, and in her green eyes, Garrett saw something he had not expected. Not just fear or determination, but something that looked almost like faith. Then she turned and opened the door. Nathaniel Blackburn's voice was like honey poured over broken glass, smooth and sweet on the surface, but hiding something that could cut you to ribbons. "Miss Blackwood, what a pleasure to see you again." "Mr. Blackburn." Eleanor's tone matched his for politeness, though both knew it was nothing but performance. "I was not expecting visitors." "Clearly not." Blackburn's pale eyes swept past her into the cabin. "I see you have made yourself quite comfortable here. Very homey, very domestic." His gaze lingered on each of the women in turn, cataloging them like possessions that had been temporarily misplaced. "I do believe this little vacation has gone on long enough. Do you not think?" "This is not a vacation." Eleanor remained in the doorway, blocking his entry. "This is our home." Blackburn chuckled, a sound completely without warmth. "Home, how charming. But you and I both know that property requires proper documentation. Legal ownership. These mountains may seem lawless, Miss Blackwood, but I assure you the law reaches everywhere I need it to reach." From his hiding spot in the back room, Garrett watched through a crack in the door. He studied Blackburn's face, memorizing every line and angle. This was the man who had killed his uncle, possibly the man who had killed his wife. And he stood there smiling, confident that nothing could touch him. "We have documentation," Eleanor replied evenly. "A contract signed by the legal owner of this property granting us residence rights." "Ah, yes, Silas Holloway." Blackburn spoke the name like he was mentioning a particularly unpleasant insect. "The poor man, dead of heart failure, I understand. Such a tragedy." His smile widened. "But surely you know that contracts signed under unusual circumstances can be challenged, particularly when the signatory was clearly not in his right mind." Rosalie stepped forward, her blue eyes blazing. "Not in his right mind, he was sharper than you will ever be." Blackburn. "Miss Brennan," Blackburn barely glanced at her, "still so full of fire. I do hope your little brother is enjoying his education back east. It would be such a shame if something were to interrupt his studies." The threat landed like a physical blow. Garrett saw Rosalie's face drain of color, saw her hand twitch toward her hidden weapon. But she held herself in check. Blackburn returned his attention to Eleanor. "I did not come here to threaten. Not today. I came to offer you a choice. All of you." "What kind of choice?" Eleanor asked. "A sensible kind." Blackburn spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "Come back with me. Willingly. I will forget about the documents you stole. I will forget about the 3 months of inconvenience you have caused me. We will call it a misunderstanding, and you can resume your previous positions with no penalty." Previous positions. Eleanor's voice could have frozen water. "You mean slavery." Such dramatic language. Blackburn sighed like a parent dealing with a difficult child. Business arrangements, contractual obligations. Nothing more sinister than that. Contracts signed under duress, threats against our families, imprisonment, murder. Eleanor listed each item with cold precision. "That is what you call business arrangements." For just a moment, the mask slipped. Garrett saw the predator beneath the polished exterior. The eyes went flat and dead, and the smile became something closer to a snarl. "I have given you a week to consider," Blackburn said, his voice losing its honeyed quality. "1 week to come to your senses. After that, I will be forced to take more direct action." He turned to leave, then paused at the edge of the porch. "Oh, and Miss Blackwood, I notice fresh horse tracks leading up from the valley. Tracks that do not match any of your animals." His pale eyes swept the cabin windows. "If you have acquired any new friends, I suggest you inform them of what happens to people who interfere in my business." He descended the steps and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. The scar-faced man and the rat-eyed man fell into formation behind him. "1 week," Blackburn called over his shoulder. "I do hope you will use the time wisely." Then they were gone, riding back down into the valley, leaving nothing behind but hoof prints in the snow and a silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Eleanor closed the door slowly. When she turned back to face the room, Garrett saw that her hands were shaking. "He knows someone else is here," Vivian said flatly. "He will find out who. Then we need to decide what we are going to do about it." Rosalie's grip on her pistol had not relaxed. "Because I am done running." Garrett stepped out of the back room. All 5 women turned to look at him. In their eyes, he saw fear, hope, suspicion, and something that might have been the first fragile seeds of trust. "You heard everything?" Eleanor asked. "I heard enough." Garrett walked to the window, looking out at the tracks Blackburn's horses had left in the snow. "3 years ago, my wife and daughter were murdered. I was told it was revenge. That a gang I was hunting tracked them down and killed them while I was away." He turned back to face the women. "I spent 3 years believing that. 3 years blaming myself for not being there, for chasing outlaws instead of protecting my family." His voice cracked slightly, but he forced himself to continue. "Now, my uncle tells me there is more to the story, that Blackburn is somehow connected, and you know something about it." Eleanor took a step toward him. "Garrett, I am not asking you to tell me today." He held up his hand. "You were right. We do not know each other. I have no right to demand your secrets when I have not earned your trust." He looked at each of the women in turn, the fierce redhead, the gentle blonde, the mysterious brunette, the competent caretaker, and Eleanor with her green eyes full of shadows and secrets. "But I am asking you to let me help. Whatever Blackburn did to my family, whatever he has done to yours, we have a common enemy, and I have spent 3 years waiting to die." He drew a deep breath, feeling something stir in his chest that he had thought was gone forever. "Maybe it is time I found something worth living for instead." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and uncertain futures. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "You may stay, Garrett Holloway, in the barn until we know you better." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "And if Blackburn returns before the week is up, you can show us what a former deputy sheriff from Kansas can do." She extended her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Garrett took it. Her palm was warm and callous, the hand of someone who had learned to work and fight and survive. "We will tell you about your wife," she said softly, her eyes holding his. "About Dodge City, about everything. But you need to prepare yourself, Garrett. The truth you are looking for is not going to bring you peace." "I have not had peace in 3 years." Garrett's grip tightened on her hand. "I will settle for answers." Outside, the winter wind picked up, sending snow swirling past the windows in ghostly spirals. Somewhere in the valley below, Nathaniel Blackburn was making plans. And in the cabin on Eagle Ridge, 6 strangers had taken the first fragile steps toward becoming allies. The fire crackled in the hearth. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls. And Garrett Holloway, who had come to this place seeking only solitude and silence, found himself surrounded by 5 women, with secrets, a dead uncle's final mission, and a dangerous man who had already taken everything from him once. Whatever came next, one thing was certain. His quiet life was over. And as he looked into Eleanor Blackwood's green eyes, he realized that for the first time in 3 years, he did not want quiet anymore. He wanted answers. He wanted justice. And he was beginning to want something else as well. Something he had thought he buried alongside Sarah and Emma in that cold Kansas cemetery 3 years ago. Hope. The first night in the barn was colder than Garrett expected. He had slept in worse places during his 3 years of wandering. Abandoned mines, open prairies, the back rooms of saloons where the stench of spilled whiskey and old vomit clung to the walls like a second skin. But there was something different about this cold. It felt deliberate, a reminder that he was not yet welcome in the warmth of the cabin, not yet trusted enough to sleep under the same roof as the 5 women he had promised to protect. Midnight stamped his hooves in the stall beside him, breath steaming in the darkness. Garrett pulled the rough wool blanket tighter around his shoulders and stared up at the wooden rafters, watching his breath form clouds in the lantern light. 5 women, 5 stories. And somewhere in the tangle of their pasts, the answer to a question that had haunted him for 3 years. What really happened to Sarah? The barn door creaked open. Garrett's hand found his revolver before his eyes found the source of the sound. But it was only Eleanor, wrapped in a heavy shawl, carrying a steaming cup in her hands. "You will freeze out here." She crossed the hay-strewn floor and held out the cup. "Coffee. It is not much, but it is warm." Garrett accepted it, wrapping his cold fingers around the ceramic. The heat seeped into his bones, and he felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Thank you. Eleanor settled onto a hay bale across from him, tucking her legs beneath her. In the soft lantern light, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her green eyes reflecting the flame, she looked almost otherworldly, like a spirit that had wandered in from some ancient tale. The others are sleeping, she said quietly. Lily cried herself to sleep as she does most nights. Rose cleaned her pistol for 2 hours before exhaustion took her. Vivian sat by the window watching the tree line until Maggie finally convinced her to rest. A small, sad smile crossed her lips. This is what our lives have become: fear and vigilance and stolen moments of peace. How long have you been running? 3 months since we escaped from Blackburn's compound. But in truth, we have been running our whole lives, running from circumstances we could not control, from men who saw us as property rather than people, from a world that told us our only value was what we could provide to others. She paused, her gaze distant. Your uncle changed that. He showed us that there was another way, that we could fight back, that our lives belonged to us, not to the men who tried to claim them. Garrett sipped the coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through him. Tell me about them, the others. How did they end up here? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, and her voice carried the weight of stories that had been waiting too long to be told. Rosalie was the daughter of horse breeders in Colorado Springs. Her family owned one of the finest operations in the territory, 40 acres of prime grazing land and a reputation for producing the strongest, fastest horses west of the Mississippi. Eleanor's voice dropped lower. Blackburn wanted that land. He was expanding his mining operations, and the Brennan property sat directly in the path of his proposed railroad spur. He offered to buy them out. When Rosalie's father refused, Blackburn found other ways to persuade him. Garrett felt his jaw tighten. What did he do? He sent men in the night. They set fire to the main barn while 30 horses were trapped inside. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as if she could still hear the screaming of the animals. Rosalie's father ran into the flames trying to save them. He never came out. And her mother died 2 months later. Some said it was grief. Some said it was poison in her evening tea. Either way, Rosalie was left alone at 19 years old with a burned-out property and debts she never knew existed. Debts that Blackburn had manufactured through forged documents and bribed officials. That is when he took her. That is when he gave her a choice. Eleanor's voice hardened. Sign a labor contract to work off the debts, or watch her 12-year-old brother disappear into one of Blackburn's mining camps. Boys that age do not last long in the tunnels. The darkness breaks them before the work does. Garrett thought of Rosalie's fierce blue eyes, the anger that simmered constantly beneath her surface. Now he understood where that fire came from. It was not just defiance. It was the burning need to save the only family she had left. Where is her brother now? A boarding school in Philadelphia. Blackburn keeps him there as insurance. As long as Rosalie cooperates, Billy stays safe. As long as she does what she is told, he receives an education instead of a grave. Eleanor met Garrett's eyes. That is why she cannot simply run. Why none of us can simply disappear. Blackburn holds pieces of our lives that we cannot abandon. The wind howled outside, rattling the barn doors. Garrett waited, knowing there was more. Lily came from Kansas. Eleanor's voice softened when she spoke of the youngest among them. A small farm outside of Wichita. Her parents were good people, simple people. They worked the land and loved their daughter and never asked for more than a decent harvest and peaceful nights. Garrett felt something twist in his stomach. Wichita, his hometown, the place where he had built a life and lost it. 3 years ago, the drought came. Crops failed across the territory. Livestock died in the fields. Families that had worked the same land for generations found themselves facing starvation. Eleanor paused. That is when Blackburn's men arrived. They offered loans, small amounts at first, just enough to buy seed for the next planting. The interest rates seemed reasonable. The terms seemed fair. They were not. They never are. The contracts were written in language that simple farmers could not understand. Hidden clauses that tripled the debt with every missed payment. Penalties that compounded faster than any crop could grow. Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. Within a year, the Ashford farm owed more than it would ever be worth, and when they could not pay, Blackburn came to collect. He took Lily. He took her as collateral, human collateral for a debt that her parents will spend the rest of their lives trying to repay. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. She was 19 years old. She had never been more than 20 miles from her home. And suddenly she was property passed from one of Blackburn's establishments to another, worked until she dropped and punished when she showed any sign of resistance. Garrett set down his coffee cup, his appetite for warmth suddenly gone. How did she end up with you? Your uncle's network. There were people inside Blackburn's operations who helped women escape. Servants, wagon drivers, even some of the guards who still had enough conscience left to be horrified by what they witnessed. Eleanor almost smiled. Lily was smuggled out in a laundry cart. She did not speak for 2 weeks after she arrived here. Just sat by the window, staring at nothing, flinching at every sound. And now she bakes bread and sings folk songs and tends a garden that will bloom with vegetables come spring. Eleanor's smile became real for just a moment. She is healing, slowly, but some wounds leave scars that never fully fade. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its cry lonely and haunting. Vivian is different from the rest of us, Eleanor continued. She was not taken by Blackburn. She chose to enter his world. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Why would anyone choose that? Because Nathaniel Blackburn murdered her sister. Eleanor's voice went flat. Catherine Thornton was a beautiful woman from a wealthy family. She caught Blackburn's eye at a society ball in Denver 15 years ago. He courted her, married her, and then when he had gained control of her family's mining interests, he had her declared dead. Declared dead? Consumption according to the official records. A tragic illness that claimed her in the winter of 1882. A funeral was held, a grave was dug, condolences were offered. Eleanor leaned forward, but Catherine did not die of consumption. She was imprisoned in a house on the outskirts of Denver, drugged and isolated, while her husband stripped her family of everything they owned. She is still alive. We believe so. Vivian has been searching for proof. For 2 years, she worked her way into Blackburn's organization, pretending to be just another desperate woman seeking employment. She cleaned his offices, served at his parties, listened at doors, and copied documents and gathered evidence of every crime he committed. Garrett felt a grudging respect for the dark-haired woman who spoke so little and watched so much. She was not cold. She was focused, driven by a love for her sister that had transformed into an all-consuming mission. Does Blackburn know who she really is? If he did, she would already be dead. Catherine was supposed to have no family, an only child, orphaned young, alone in the world. The perfect victim. Eleanor's lips twisted bitterly. Blackburn did not know about the younger sister who had been raised by an aunt in San Francisco. The sister who grew up hearing stories of the beautiful Catherine and wondering what had become of her. So Vivian came looking for answers. She came looking for justice, and when your uncle discovered her true identity, he brought her into our group. Her knowledge of Blackburn's operations has been invaluable. She knows his schedules, his habits, the locations of his properties, and the names of his co-conspirators. Eleanor fell silent, and Garrett knew they had reached the last story, the one she had been avoiding. And you, he asked quietly, how did you come to be here? For a long moment, Eleanor did not answer. She stared into the lantern flame, her green eyes reflecting the light, like emeralds catching the sun. My father was Jonathan Blackwood. He owned a bank in Denver, a respectable institution that served respectable clients. Her voice had gone distant, traveling back through years of pain. What he did not know was that Blackburn had been using his bank to launder money, profits from the trafficking operations, bribes paid to officials, blood money disguised as legitimate business transactions. Your father discovered it. He found discrepancies in the accounts, transfers that did not match any recorded deposits. He was a meticulous man, my father, an honest man in a profession that rewarded dishonesty. He began to investigate. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them together to still them. The bank burned down on a Tuesday night. My father was inside working late as he always did. The fire marshal ruled it an accident, a knocked-over lamp, a tragic loss. Her voice broke. I was 23 years old. My mother was still alive then, bedridden with a wasting illness that had slowly stolen her strength over the previous year. Blackburn came to you. He came with sympathy and offers of assistance. He paid for my father's funeral. He arranged for my mother's and when the bills became more than I could manage, he offered me a position in his household. Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. A companion for his elderly aunt, he said. A respectable job for a respectable young woman. Garrett could see where this was going, could feel the familiar pattern of manipulation and control that Blackburn seemed to employ like an artist wielding a brush. There was no aunt. There was nothing respectable about any of it. By the time I understood what I had agreed to, my mother was completely dependent on Blackburn's physicians for her medication. If I ran, if I resisted, if I did anything other than exactly what I was told, she would be the one to suffer. When did she pass? Last spring, peacefully in her sleep with me holding her hand. Eleanor wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. That was the night I decided to run. Your uncle had already made contact with me through his network. He had been gathering evidence against Blackburn for months, and I had access to documents that could bring the whole operation crashing down. She reached into her shawl and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This is why Blackburn wants us back. Not just because we escaped, because we took this with us. She handed the document to Garrett. He unfolded it carefully, tilting it toward the lantern light. It was a ledger page, columns of numbers, names, dates, amounts. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than standard bookkeeping. But as Garrett's eyes moved across the entries, he began to understand what he was looking at. Payment records for judges, for sheriffs, for territorial officials at every level of government. Blackburn had been systematically buying the entire justice system of Colorado Territory. And at the bottom of the page, a name that made Garrett's blood run cold. McCready Brothers, services rendered, $500. The date was 3 years ago, 2 weeks before Sarah and Emma were murdered. Garrett's hands began to shake. The paper rattled in his grip, and he had to force himself to take slow, deep breaths to keep from screaming. Where did you get this? His voice came out as a rasp. From Blackburn's personal safe. Vivian found the combination. We took everything we could carry that night. Eleanor's eyes were fixed on his face, watching his reaction. I did not know what it meant. Not until your uncle read the names and turned pale as death. McCready Brothers. Garrett could barely form the words. They killed my wife, my daughter. I spent 3 years thinking it was revenge for the men I hunted. But Blackburn paid them. Garrett. Eleanor moved to sit beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body through his coat. I am so sorry. I wanted to tell you when we first met, but I did not know if you could be trusted. I did not know if you would believe me. Why? The word tore out of him. Why would Blackburn pay to have a deputy sheriff's family murdered? I do not know, not yet. Eleanor placed her hand over his, stilling the trembling. But there has to be a connection. Your uncle believed there was. He spent the last months of his life trying to find it. Garrett stared at the paper in his hands. $500. That was the price Blackburn had put on Sarah's life. On Emma's life. On everything Garrett had ever loved. Tell me. His voice had gone quiet, dangerous. Tell me about Dodge City. Tell me what my wife was doing there. Eleanor took a deep breath. Sarah came to Dodge City 2 weeks before she died. She was investigating the disappearance of a young woman named Emily Carter, a girl from Wichita who had vanished without a trace. Eleanor paused. Your wife was smart, Garrett. She followed a trail of clues that led her to one of Blackburn's establishments, a boarding house where women were held against their will. Sarah found evidence. She found more than evidence. She found testimony, women willing to speak about what had been done to them. Names, dates, locations. Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened. She was building a case that would have exposed Blackburn's entire operation. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Sarah had always been fierce, always willing to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. It was one of the things Garrett had loved most about her, and it had gotten her killed. She contacted your uncle's network, Eleanor continued. She was supposed to meet with me. I was going to help her get the evidence to someone who could use it, a journalist, a federal marshal, someone outside Blackburn's reach. What happened? She never made it to the meeting. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. 2 days later, I heard that a deputy sheriff's family had been murdered in Wichita. Revenge killing, they said. Gang retaliation. It was not revenge. No, it was silencing. Blackburn found out what she was doing, and he made sure she could never tell anyone what she had learned. Garrett sat in the coal barn, holding the proof of his family's murder in his trembling hands. 3 years. 3 years of guilt and grief and self-hatred. 3 years of believing that his pursuit of justice had brought death to his doorstep. But it was not his fault. It had never been his fault. Sarah died because she was brave, because she saw evil and refused to look away, because she was fighting the same fight that these 5 women were fighting now. Something shifted inside Garrett. Something that had been frozen for 3 years began to thaw, and in its place something else grew. Something that felt like purpose. I am staying. The words came out stronger than he expected. Not just for the weak, not just until Blackburn leaves you alone. I am staying until this is finished, until he pays for everything he has done. Eleanor studied his face, searching for something in his eyes. You understand what that means. Blackburn has an army. He has the law on his side. Fighting him could cost you everything. I have already lost everything. Garrett folded the ledger page carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. But maybe I can help you save what you still have. For the first time since they met, Eleanor smiled. Not the guarded smile of a woman protecting herself from disappointment, a real smile that reached her eyes and softened the sharp edges of her beauty. Then welcome to Eagle Ridge, Garrett Holloway. She squeezed his hand one final time before releasing it. Tomorrow I will introduce you to everyone properly. We will share our plans, our resources, our hopes for bringing Blackburn to justice. She stood, drawing her shawl tighter against the cold. And when you are ready, I will tell you everything I know about Sarah, every detail of what she discovered, every piece of the puzzle that your uncle left behind. Garrett looked up at her, this woman who carried so much pain behind her green eyes. Thank you, he said, for trusting me with the truth. Eleanor paused at the barn door, her silhouette framed against the darkness beyond. I am not sure if it is trust yet, but it might be hope. She glanced back over her shoulder. It has been a long time since any of us had that. Then she was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving Garrett alone with his grief and his rage and the first fragile spark of something that felt almost like redemption. He did not sleep that night. He sat with his back against the barn wall, listening to the wind howl through the mountains, thinking about Sarah and Emma and the terrible price of courage. And somewhere in the darkness of those hours, Garrett Holloway made a decision. He had come to Eagle Ridge to die. Now he had a reason to live. The morning brought gray skies and the promise of more snow. Garrett emerged from the barn to find the cabin already alive with activity. Smoke rose from the chimney, the smell of baking bread drifted across the yard, and through the windows he could see the women moving about their daily routines. It looked almost peaceful, almost normal, as if they were simply a group of friends, sharing a mountain home rather than fugitives, hiding from a man who would see them destroyed. Rosalie was the first to notice him. She stood near the corral, brushing one of the horses with long practiced strokes. Her red hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her blue eyes tracked his approach with wary assessment. You survived the night. It was not quite a greeting, but it was not hostile either. I half expected you to be gone by morning. Most men run when they realize what we are up against. I am not most men. So Eleanor says. Rosalie returned her attention to the horse, a beautiful chestnut mare with intelligent eyes. This is Copper. She was the last horse I bred before Blackburn burned our ranch. I smuggled her out in the middle of the night, rode her halfway across the territory with nothing but the clothes on my back. She ran her hand along the mare's flank with obvious affection. She is all I have left of my family, her and Billy. Garrett moved to stand beside her, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. Eleanor told me about your brother. I am sorry. Sorry does not bring back the dead, does not free the living. Rosalie's jaw tightened, but maybe justice will. Before Garrett could respond, the cabin door opened and Lily appeared carrying a basket of fresh bread. Her golden hair caught the pale morning light, and despite the shadows under her eyes, her smile was genuine. Breakfast is ready. Maggie made eggs, and there is coffee on the stove. She hesitated, then added shyly, I hope you like sourdough. It is my mother's recipe. I am sure it is wonderful, Garrett said, and was surprised to find that he meant it. They ate together around the large wooden table in the main room. Garrett sat at one end watching the dynamics between the five women. Eleanor took the head of the table, naturally directing the conversation with quiet authority. Rosalie sat with her back to the wall, positioned where she could see both the door and the windows. Lily served everyone before herself, her movements quick and nervous. Vivian ate in silence, her dark eyes observing everything while revealing nothing. And Maggie moved between the kitchen and the table like a mother hen, making sure everyone had enough food, enough coffee, enough warmth. They were a family, Garrett realized. Not by blood, but by circumstance, by shared suffering and shared survival. They had found each other in the darkness of Blackburn's world, and they had formed bonds that went deeper than any legal document could define. And now somehow he had become part of it. After breakfast, they gathered in the main room to discuss their situation. Eleanor spread a hand-drawn map across the table, marking locations with small stones. Blackburn's primary residence is here in Silver Creek. He also maintains properties in Denver, Colorado Springs, and several remote locations throughout the territory. She pointed to each in turn. His mining operations are scattered across the mountains. Most of them are legitimate on the surface, but the deeper tunnels are where he keeps the workers who have nowhere else to go. How many men does he have? Garrett asked. At least 50 that we know of. Armed guards, enforcers, men who will do anything for money and ask no questions. Vivian's voice was cold and precise. He also has informal arrangements with various outlaw bands. The McCready brothers were not unique. Blackburn uses criminals to do the work that even his own men will not touch. Garrett filed that information away. If Blackburn employed outlaws, there might be others who knew details about Sarah's death. Others who could be persuaded to talk. What about allies, he asked. Sheriff, federal marshal. Anyone in authority who is not on Blackburn's payroll. Sheriff Daniel Hartley in the next county. Maggie spoke up for the first time. He has been investigating Blackburn for 2 years, but he has never had enough evidence to bring charges. Blackburn's lawyers are too good. His connections are too deep. We have evidence now. Eleanor tapped the table. The documents we took from his safe. The testimony we can provide. If we can get it to Hartley without Blackburn intercepting us, we might finally have a chance. A week. Garrett leaned back in his chair. Blackburn gave us a week. How do we use it? The planning session continued through the morning and into the afternoon. They discussed escape routes and hiding places. They reviewed the evidence and identified the most damaging documents. They debated whether to move immediately or fortify their position and wait. Through it all, Garrett found himself watching Eleanor, the way she listened to each woman's input, the way she weighed options and made decisions, the way she carried the weight of leadership without complaint. She was remarkable. They all were. 5 women who had every reason to surrender, to accept defeat, to bow before the power that sought to crush them. Instead, they fought. They planned. They refused to let Blackburn win. It was late afternoon when Garrett found himself alone with Eleanor on the cabin porch. The other women had dispersed to various tasks. Rosalie was training horses in the corral. Lily was preparing dinner. Vivian had vanished somewhere, as she often did. Maggie was organizing medical supplies. The sun hung low over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. The beauty of a land that would kill you if you underestimated it. Tell me about Sarah. Garrett's voice surprised him. He had not intended to speak, but the question had been building inside him all day, pressing against his ribs like a caged animal demanding release. Eleanor turned to face him. In the fading light, her green eyes looked almost gray. What do you want to know? Everything. Who she spoke to, what she found, why she kept it from me. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She was trying to protect you. The words came slowly. That is what she told my contact in Dodge City. She knew you would want to help, knew you would put yourself in danger. So she kept her investigation secret, planning to bring you in only when she had enough evidence to guarantee a conviction. Garrett closed his eyes. That sounded exactly like Sarah. Stubborn, brave, determined to shield him from anything she thought might hurt him. It had gotten her killed instead. She loved you. Eleanor's voice was soft. I could hear it in the way she talked about you. The deputy sheriff who always did the right thing even when it cost him. She said you were the best man she had ever known. Something hot pricked at Garrett's eyes. He blinked it away. I failed her. I should have known something was wrong. Should have seen that she was hiding something. You cannot protect someone from their own courage. Eleanor moved closer close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence against the cold mountain air. Sarah made her choices. She knew the risks. And she would not want you to spend the rest of your life drowning in guilt. Garrett turned to look at her, this woman who carried her own guilt, her own grief, her own memories of the people she could not save. How do you do it, he asked. How do you keep going after everything you have lost? Eleanor considered the question. I think about the women who are still trapped, the ones we might be able to save. Every day that I survive is a day that Blackburn has not won. Every breath I take is an act of defiance against everything he tried to do to me. She paused. And I think about justice. Not revenge. Justice. The belief that someday, somehow, the scales will balance. Is that enough? Some days it is all I have. They stood together in silence, watching the sun sink behind the peaks. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called to its mate. I have not talked about them in 3 years. Garrett's voice was barely audible. Sarah and Emma. I could not bear to say their names. What was Emma like? The question unlocked something inside him. Words began to pour out, words he had been holding back for so long that they had grown roots in his chest. She was 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes, blue like the sky on a summer morning, and she laughed at everything. The smallest things would make her giggle, a butterfly landing on her nose, a funny face from across the dinner table. Garrett's voice cracked, but he kept going. She called me Papa, not Father, not Daddy, Papa, and every night before bed she would make me check under her bed for monsters. I told her there were no monsters. I promised her she was safe. He fell silent. The memory was too sharp, too real. Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin. You did not fail her, Garrett. Blackburn killed them. Not you. Not your choices. Him. I know. The admission came hard. But knowing does not make it hurt less. No, it does not. Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. But maybe when this is over, you will be able to say their names without feeling like you are drowning. Maybe that is the first step toward peace. They stood there together as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who had lost everything, finding something unexpected in the wreckage of their lives. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of understanding, the beginning of trust, and perhaps the first fragile seeds of hope. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Garrett dreamed of Sarah without waking up screaming. She was standing in a field of wildflowers, Emma's arm in her arms, smiling at him with that smile that had always made him feel like the luckiest man alive. You need to let us go, she said. You need to live again. And when he woke in the coal barn with tears on his face, he thought maybe she was right. Maybe it was time. The week that Blackburn had given them was already half over when Garrett noticed something strange. Vivian had been disappearing every night, slipping out of the cabin after midnight and returning just before dawn. No one seemed to question it. No one seemed concerned. But Garrett watched and wondered. On the 4th night, he followed her. She moved through the forest like a ghost, her dark clothing blending with the shadows. She rode one of the horses bareback, guiding it through paths that Garrett would never have found on his own. He kept his distance, relying on the tracking skills that had made him one of the best deputy sheriffs in Kansas. She rode for nearly an hour before stopping at a small clearing. A single lantern burned there, casting a circle of light against the darkness. And standing in that light was a woman Garrett did not recognize. She was older, perhaps 50, with silver-threaded hair and a face that bore the marks of both beauty and suffering. She wore traveling clothes, practical and worn, and she embraced Vivian with the fierce tenderness of family long separated. Garrett could not hear their words, but he watched them talk for nearly an hour, exchanging documents and whispered confidences. And when Vivian finally mounted her horse to return, she was carrying a package that had not been there before. He slipped back to the cabin before her, his mind racing with questions. Who was the woman? What was in the package and why had Vivian been keeping secrets from the others? The answers would come soon enough. But for now, Garrett simply added it to the growing list of mysteries surrounding Eagle Ridge. The mystery of his wife's death. The mystery of his uncle's final days. The mystery of 5 women who had somehow become the most important people in his life. He fell asleep as the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains. The sound of Vivian's returning horse, the last thing he heard before dreams claimed him. Dreams of justice. Dreams of vengeance. And somewhere beneath all of it, the first fragile dream of something that might someday feel like home. The morning after Garrett followed Vivian through the forest, he said nothing. He watched her at breakfast, searching for any sign that she knew she had been followed. But Vivian Crane was a fortress of stillness, her dark eyes revealing nothing as she sipped her coffee and listened to the others discuss the day's plans. If she suspected anything, she gave no indication. Garrett decided to wait, to observe. Whatever secret Vivian was keeping, it would reveal itself in time. For now, there were more pressing concerns. 5 days remained before Blackburn's deadline expired. We need to be ready. Garrett stood at the head of the table, the map spread before him, marked with red circles and handwritten notes. When Blackburn returns, he will not come with 3 men. He will bring an army. Rosalie snorted. We know that. We have been running from his armies for 3 months. Running is not the same as fighting. Garrett met her fierce blue eyes without flinching. You have survived by staying ahead of him, by disappearing before he could catch you. That will not work forever. Eventually, you have to stand and face what is chasing you. And you think we can win? Lily's voice was small, uncertain. Against all those men, I think we can survive. And I think we can hurt him badly enough that he thinks twice before coming after you again. Garrett looked around the table at each woman in turn, but only if we prepare, only if we work together. The training began that afternoon. Garrett had expected resistance. He had expected these women, who had been controlled and dominated by men for so long, to bristle at taking orders from another one. But they surprised him. They were hungry to learn. They had been victims long enough. Now they wanted to become something else. He started with the basics: defensive positions around the cabin, escape routes through the forest, hand signals for silent communication. The women absorbed everything like drought-parched earth drinking in rain. Rosalie already knew how to shoot. Her father had taught her back before the fire took everything. She handled her pistol with the easy confidence of someone who had been born with a weapon in her hand. Not bad, Garrett admitted after watching her put 6 rounds through a target at 30 yards. But you telegraph your shots. Your shoulder drops just before you squeeze the trigger. My father never mentioned that. Your father taught you to hunt. I am teaching you to fight. Garrett adjusted her stance, his hands professional and impersonal on her shoulders. In a gunfight, the other person is watching for that tell. They will move before your bullet leaves the barrel. Rosalie practiced for another hour, her jaw set with determination. By the end, her shoulder stayed steady. Vivian was a revelation. She moved like water, flowing around obstacles, appearing and disappearing with a speed that left Garrett genuinely impressed. When he handed her a knife for close quarters training, she demonstrated techniques he had never seen before. Where did you learn that, San Francisco? Vivian's voice was flat, emotionless. The docs are not kind to young women who cannot protect themselves. She did not elaborate, and Garrett did not ask. Lily was the most difficult. She flinched at loud noises. Her hands shook when she held a weapon. The trauma of her captivity had left scars that went deeper than skin, but she refused to give up. I will not be helpless again. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. Whatever happens, I will not be taken without a fight. Garrett taught her to aim, to breathe, to find the stillness at the center of fear. By the 3rd day, she could hit a target at 15 yards. Not perfect, but enough. Maggie observed everything with her medical eye, making notes about injuries that might occur, supplies that would be needed, procedures that could save lives if the worst happened. She had been a healer too long to think only of destruction. Even in preparation for battle, she focused on survival. And Eleanor watched it all. She stood apart during the training sessions, her green eyes tracking every movement, every interaction, every small moment of progress. She was their leader, but she understood that in matters of combat, Garrett had knowledge she lacked. So she deferred to his expertise while maintaining her authority over the group's larger decisions. It was a delicate balance, and somehow they made it work. On the fifth evening, as the sun painted the mountains in shades of crimson and gold, Garrett found Eleanor standing alone on the cabin porch. She was staring west toward the peaks that separated their valley from the world beyond. "You did well today." Garrett moved to stand beside her, close enough to talk, far enough to respect boundaries. "They are learning quickly. They have motivation." Eleanor's voice was distant. "Fear is an excellent teacher. So is hope." She turned to look at him, something flickering in her green eyes. "Do you have hope, Garrett Holloway? After everything you have lost?" He considered the question. A week ago, the answer would have been no. A week ago, he had come to this mountain expecting to die alone, waiting for death like an old friend who had taken too long to arrive. But something had changed. Something had shifted inside him during these days of training and planning and quiet conversations by firelight. "I am beginning to," he admitted. "I did not expect that." Eleanor smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of her lips, but it transformed her face, made her look younger, made her look like the woman she might have been if Blackburn had never touched her life. "Sarah was lucky to have you." The words came softly. "I know it does not feel that way. I know you carry the weight of what happened like a stone around your neck. But she was lucky to be loved like that, to have someone who would never stop fighting for her." Garrett felt the familiar ache in his chest, but for the first time it did not feel like drowning. It felt like remembering, honoring. The difference was subtle, but it was everything. "Tell me something about yourself." He surprised himself with the request. Something that has nothing to do with Blackburn or survival or pain. Something from before. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she laughed, a sound like bells in the mountain air. "I wanted to be a singer. A singer, I am. My mother had the most beautiful voice. She used to sing me to sleep every night. Old songs from her grandmother's country. Songs about love and loss and the way the world looks when the morning sun hits the sea." Eleanor's eyes went soft with memory. "I used to practice in front of the mirror, pretending I was on a stage in New York or Paris, pretending that thousands of people had come just to hear me. What happened? Reality happened. My father needed help at the bank. My mother got sick. The dreams of a young girl gave way to the responsibilities of a woman." She shrugged, but there was old grief in the gesture. "I have not sung in years. I am not sure I remember how." Garrett reached out without thinking, his fingers brushing against the back of her hand. It was the briefest of contacts, but it sent electricity through both of them. "Maybe someday you will sing again." Eleanor looked down at where his fingers had touched her skin. When she raised her eyes to meet his, there was something new in them. Something vulnerable, and afraid, and desperately hopeful. "Maybe someday," she whispered. They stood together in silence as the last light faded from the sky. The space between them seemed to shrink, though neither moved. It was a moment suspended in amber, perfect and fragile and utterly uncertain. Then the cabin door burst open and Rosalie's voice shattered the spell. "We have a problem. Vivian is gone." They searched for an hour before giving up. Her horse was missing from the corral. Her few personal belongings remained in the cabin, which meant she intended to return. But no one knew where she had gone or why she had chosen tonight to disappear. "This is not the first time," Maggie's voice was worried. "She has been slipping out at night for weeks. I thought she was just walking, processing. We all have our ways of coping." Garrett said nothing. He thought of the silver-haired woman in the forest clearing, the package Vivian had carried back, the secrets that hung around her like a cloak. "She will return." Eleanor's voice was firm, but Garrett could hear the uncertainty beneath it. "Whatever she is doing, she would not abandon us. Not now." They waited. Midnight came and went. The fire burned low in the hearth. One by one, the others drifted off to sleep, exhaustion finally overcoming anxiety. Only Garrett and Eleanor remained awake, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, cups of cold coffee growing colder between them. "You know something?" Eleanor's green eyes fixed on his face. "About where she goes." Garrett hesitated. Then he told her about following Vivian through the forest and in the clearing. about the package and the whispered conversation he had not been able to hear. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, processing. The woman. What did she look like? Older, 50 perhaps, silver hair, worn traveling clothes. Garrett paused, remembering. Beautiful in a faded sort of way, like someone who had been through fire and come out the other side. Eleanor's face went pale. Catherine. The name came out as a breath. That was Catherine Blackburn. The pieces fell into place with sudden clarity. Vivian's secret missions, her knowledge of Blackburn's operations, her willingness to risk everything for evidence she had never fully explained. She had found her sister. She is alive. Garrett felt the weight of the revelation. Blackburn's wife. She really survived. More than survived. Eleanor's voice was urgent now. If Catherine is free, if she has been gathering evidence from outside while Vivian gathered it from inside, they could have everything we need. Documents, testimony, proof of every crime Blackburn has ever committed. Before Garrett could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night. A single rider approaching fast. Vivian burst through the door moments later, her dark hair while her chest heaving from the hard ride. But her eyes were bright with something that looked almost like triumph. I found her. The words tumbled out between gasps for breath. Catherine. She has been hiding in Denver this whole time. She has testimony from 12 other women. Financial records, forged contracts, everything. She dropped a leather satchel on the table. It landed with a heavy thump. This is how we destroy him. Eleanor opened the satchel with trembling hands. Inside were stacks of papers, each one more damning than the last. Ledgers showing payments to corrupt officials. Contracts with signatures obtained through torture and threats. Letters that revealed the full scope of Blackburn's empire of suffering. And at the bottom, a single photograph. A wedding portrait. Nathaniel Blackburn, younger and less gray, standing beside a beautiful woman in white. Catherine Blackburn. Alive. And ready to testify. When Eleanor's voice shook. When can we meet her? 3 days. Vivian straightened her composure, returning. She will come to a safe location outside Silver Creek. With Sheriff Hartley. He has been protecting her since she escaped. 3 days. Less than what Blackburn had given them. But if they could reach Catherine before the deadline expired, if they could get this evidence to the right people, everything would change. We need to tell the others. Garrett stood, his mind already racing through logistics and dangers. Plan our route. Prepare for the possibility that Blackburn will try to stop us. Vivian nodded, but she caught his arm before he could move. There is something else. Her dark eyes met his. In Catherine's papers. She found records of payments made 3 years ago. Payments to a gang of outlaws in Kansas. Garrett's blood ran cold. McCready brothers. Yes. Vivian's grip tightened. But there is more. Catherine found out why Blackburn ordered the hit. She took a breath. Your wife discovered something during her investigation. Something that Blackburn could not allow to become public. Something about his past. His real past. What do you mean, his real past? Nathaniel Blackburn is not his real name, and the fortune he built did not come from mining. Vivian's voice dropped to a whisper. Catherine will explain everything when we meet, but you need to be prepared, Garrett. What she knows, what your wife knew, it changes everything. Garrett stood frozen as Vivian released his arm and walked toward the back rooms to wake the others. His mind churned with questions, with rage, with the desperate need to understand. Sarah had died for a secret, and in 3 days he would finally learn what it was. The cabin erupted into activity as the women woke and gathered around the table. Plans were made, routes were debated, weapons were checked, and supplies were packed. But through it all, Garrett could not shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something vast. Something that went far deeper than any of them had imagined. Blackburn was not just a criminal. He was something worse. And whatever truth Sarah had died protecting it was about to come to light. The news of Catherine Blackburn changed everything. They had 2 days to prepare. 2 days to plan their route to the meeting point outside Silver Creek. 2 days before they would finally have the evidence needed to bring Nathaniel Blackburn to justice. But Blackburn was not a man who waited. On the morning after Vivian's revelation, Garrett woke to the sound of Rosalie's urgent whisper cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. We have company. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand finding his revolver before his eyes fully adjusted to the dim light. Through the barn's weathered slats, he could see shadows moving at the edge of the tree line. Too many shadows. Too organized to be animals. How many? His voice was barely a breath. At least 15, maybe more. Rowsley's blue eyes were hard as flint. They surrounded us during the night. We are trapped. Garrett's mind raced through options. 15 men against one former deputy and 5 women. The cabin was defensible, but not against a prolonged siege. They had supplies for perhaps a week, ammunition for perhaps an hour of sustained combat. The math did not favor them. "Wake the others," he said quietly. "We need to move. Move where they have every approach covered." Not every approach. Garrett remembered something from his childhood visits, a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time, but now might mean the difference between life and death. "Your uncle mentioned a tunnel once, a way out through the mountain." Rosalie's eyes widened. The mine shaft. Silas used it to smuggle women out when Blackburn's men came too close. "Where does it exit?" "Half a mile north, near the old mill ruins." It was their only chance. They moved through the cabin like ghosts, gathering weapons and essential supplies. Eleanor coordinated the evacuation with quiet efficiency, her green eyes betraying none of the fear that must have been churning beneath her calm exterior. Lily trembled as she stuffed documents into a satchel, but her hands did not stop moving. Vivian checked her knife, her dark eyes cold with the promise of violence. Maggie packed medical supplies with the methodical precision of someone who knew exactly what wounds looked like and how to treat them. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath a trapdoor in the root cellar. Garrett went first, holding a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to pass, and the air smelled of earth and old secrets. They had been moving for perhaps 10 minutes when the first gunshot echoed behind them. Then the screaming began. "They found the tunnel." Vivian's voice was flat, stating fact rather than expressing fear. "They are coming. Move faster." Garrett pushed forward his wounded shoulder, screaming in protest as he scraped against the stone walls. "Do not stop for anything." The tunnel seemed to stretch forever. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Boots on stone, shouted commands. The occasional crack of gunfire as Blackburn's men fired blindly into the darkness. Then they burst into moonlight. The exit opened onto a rocky hillside overlooking a frozen stream. The old mill ruins loomed nearby, their skeletal timbers, reaching toward the star-filled sky like the bones of some ancient creature. The horses. Eleanor pointed toward a small barn that Garrett had not noticed before. Silas kept emergency mounts here. They ran. Garrett could hear the men emerging from the tunnel behind them, could hear Blackburn's calm voice cutting through the chaos, directing his forces with the cold precision of a general commanding troops. "Spread out, cover the Apaches. I want them alive if possible, dead if necessary." The barn contained 6 horses already saddled, as if Silas had known this moment would come. They mounted in seconds, years of frontier living, making the motions automatic. "Ride for the northern pass," Eleanor's voice carried despite the chaos. "We regroup at the shepherd's cabin. Everyone knows where it is." They scattered into the night. Garrett hung back, placing himself between the fleeing women and the men pouring out of the tunnel. His revolver barked twice and 2 of Blackburn's men fell. A third raised his rifle and Garrett felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder before he heard the shot. The pain was extraordinary. White-hot agony that threatened to pull him from the saddle. But he had felt worse, had survived worse, and he would not let these women die while he still had breath in his body. He fired again. Another man fell. Then he was riding midnight's powerful legs, eating up the distance between him and safety. The wind tore at his face. Blood soaked through his coat. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit began to fade as the darkness swallowed him whole. He rode for what felt like hours. The shepherd's cabin appeared through the trees just as the first gray light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. It was small, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but smoke was rising from the chimney. Someone had made it. Garrett dismounted clumsily, his left arm hanging useless at his side. The cabin door flew open and Eleanor was there, her green eyes wide with relief and terror. "You are hurt." Her hands were on him, immediately checking the wound, assessing the damage. "It is not as bad as it looks." The lie came automatically. "Where are the others?" "Inside." Rosalie and Vivian made it. Maggie arrived just before you. Something cold settled in Garrett's stomach. And Lily. Eleanor's face crumbled. The mask of composure she had maintained through everything finally shattered, revealing the raw fear beneath. She was right behind us. I saw her mount. I saw her ride. Eleanor's voice broke. But she never arrived. They searched as soon as there was enough light to see. They found Lily's horse wandering riderless near the frozen stream, its saddle splashed with blood. They found tracks in the snow where multiple riders had converged. They found signs of a struggle, but they did not find Lily. He has her. Rosalie's voice was hollow. Blackburn has her. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. Sweet, gentle Lily. The girl who baked bread and sang folk songs and flinched at loud noises. The girl who had survived so much only to be dragged back into the nightmare she had escaped. We have to go back. Vivian was already moving toward her horse. We have to... No. Eleanor's voice cut through the panic like a blade. That is exactly what he wants. He is using her as bait. If we ride back there now, we all die and Lily dies with us. So we just leave her. Rosalie's blue eyes blazed with fury. We abandon her to that monster. We get help. Garrett forced the words out through the pain in his shoulder. We reach Catherine and Sheriff Hartley. We bring back enough force to take Blackburn down permanently. That is 2 days away. Maggie's medical training had taken over her hands working to bandage Garrett's wound, even as her voice trembled. What will he do to her in 2 days? No one answered. They all knew. They had all lived through what Blackburn did to the women in his power. Eleanor made the decision. We split up. Vivian goes to meet Catherine as planned. She knows the route, knows the recognition signals. Eleanor's voice was steady now, the leader emerging from the woman who had nearly broken. The rest of us find a place to hide. We wait for reinforcements. And Lily is strong. Eleanor met Garrett's eyes and he saw the desperate hope there. The need to believe that they were not condemning their friend to death. She survived before. She will survive now. And when we come for her, Blackburn will learn what happens to men who hurt the people we love. They buried their trail as best they could. They rode through streams to hide their tracks. They doubled back and circled around and used every trick that Garrett had learned in his years of hunting outlaws. By nightfall, they had found shelter in a cave system that Rosalie remembered from her childhood. It was cold and dark and smelled of animals, but it was hidden. For now, that was enough. Garrett sat with his back against the stone wall, his shoulder throbbing with every heartbeat. Eleanor sat beside him close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body through his coat. This is my fault. Her voice was barely audible. I should have made sure she was with us. I should have. You did everything you could. Garrett's good hand found hers in the darkness. We all did. It is not enough. No, it is not. He squeezed her fingers gently. But we are not done yet. We will get her back, Eleanor. I promise you that. She turned to look at him, her green eyes catching what little light filtered into the cave. How can you promise something like that? You do not know what will happen. You do not know if any of us will survive. I know that I am not going to let Blackburn win. Not this time. Garrett's voice hardened with conviction. He took my wife, my daughter, my uncle. He has taken everything from me. But he will not take Lily, and he will not take you. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion. It was something deeper, something more desperate. The kiss of two people clinging to each other in the darkness, refusing to let go. When she pulled back, there were tears on her cheeks. I am scared, Garrett. For the first time since this started, I am truly scared. So am I. He pulled her closer, letting her head rest against his good shoulder. But we are scared together, and that has to count for something. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Somewhere out there, Lily was alone with a monster. Somewhere out there, Blackburn was planning his next move. But in the cave, surrounded by darkness and danger and the uncertain future, Garrett Holloway held Eleanor Blackwood and made himself a promise. He would save Lily. He would destroy Blackburn, and when it was over, he would find a way to live again. Not just survive, live. For Sarah, for Emma, for the 5 women who had given him something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The message arrived at dawn, a single piece of paper pinned to a tree near the cave entrance by a knife that Garrett recognized. It belonged to one of the men he had shot during the escape. Eleanor read the words aloud, her voice trembling. You have 48 hours. Bring me the documents and the women. In exchange, the young one lives. Refuse, and I will send her back to you in pieces. You know I am a man of my word. Sincerely, Nathaniel Blackburn. Rosalie's fist slammed against the cave wall. That bastard. That absolute bastard. 48 hours. Vivian's dark eyes calculated distances and travel times. That is not enough time to reach Catherine and return with help. It is not meant to be. Garrett took the note from Eleanor, shaking hands. He is forcing us to choose. Save Lily now or save everyone later. What do we do? Maggie asked, her voice small. Garrett looked at the four women who had become his family. At Eleanor, whose green eyes held fear and fury in equal measure. At Rosalie, whose hands clenched into fists at her sides. At Vivian, whose cold exterior could not quite hide the desperation beneath. At Maggie, whose healing hands would be useless against the violence that was coming. We do both, he said. Vivian continues to Catherine. The rest of us go get Lily. That is suicide, Rosalie said flatly. Maybe. Garrett checked his revolver, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. But I have been waiting to die for 3 years. Might as well make it count for something. Eleanor stepped forward and took his face in her hands. You are not dying today, Garrett Holloway. None of us are. Her voice was fierce, her green eyes blazing. We are going to save Lily. We are going to destroy Blackburn. And we are going to live, all of us, together. She kissed him again, hard and fast, a promise sealed with fire. Now let us go get our girl back. The ride to Silver Creek took 6 hours. Garrett pushed through the pain in his shoulder, gritting his teeth against every jolt of the saddle. Beside him, Eleanor rode in grim silence, her green eyes fixed on the horizon. Rosalie flanked them on the left, her hand never straying far from her pistol. Maggie brought up the rear, her medical bag clutched against her chest like a talisman. Vivian had departed before dawn, riding hard toward the rendezvous point where Catherine waited. If everything went according to plan, she would return with Sheriff Hartley and enough deputies to overwhelm Blackburn's forces. But that was 2 days away, and Lily did not have 2 days. Silver Creek appeared through the trees just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks. It was a mining town, rough and raw, its single main street lined with saloons and general stores, and the kind of establishment as that catered to men who worked with their hands and spent their wages on whiskey. We need allies, Garrett said as they slowed their horses to a walk. Someone in authority who is not on Blackburn's payroll. Good luck with that. Rosalie's voice dripped with bitterness. Blackburn owns this town. He owns every town within 100 miles. There has to be someone. But as they made their way through Silver Creek, Garrett's hope began to fade. The sheriff's office was their first stop. Deputy Morrison, a heavy-set man with small eyes and a permanent sneer, listened to their story with barely concealed contempt. Let me understand, he said, leaning back in his chair. You want me to arrest Nathaniel Blackburn, the most respected businessman in the territory, based on accusations from a bunch of runaway women and a drifter with a gunshot wound. We have evidence, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her eyes. Documents proving Morrison cut her off with a wave of his hand. Mr. Blackburn is a pillar of this community. He employs half the men in this town. He built the church and the schoolhouse. And you expect me to believe he is some kind of monster? He kidnapped one of our friends, a young woman named Lily Ashford. He is holding her prisoner right now. Morrison's smile was ugly. Miss Ashford is a contracted employee who violated the terms of her agreement. Mr. Blackburn has every legal right to recover his property. She is not property. Garrett's voice came out low and dangerous. She is a human being. She is whatever the law says she is. Morrison stood, his hand resting on his gun belt. Now I suggest you folks move along before I decide to arrest you for making false accusations against an upstanding citizen. They left. The church was no better. Reverend Patterson, a thin man with watery eyes and nervous hands, wrung his fingers as he listened to their plea. I sympathize with your situation, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Truly I do, but the church cannot involve itself in legal disputes. Mr. Blackburn has been a generous benefactor. His donations have kept this congregation alive during difficult times. His money comes from slavery, Eleanor said, from trafficking women and working them to death. Patterson's face went pale. Those are serious allegations, Miss Blackwood. Allegations that would require proof. Substantial proof. We have proof. Then take it to the proper authorities. Patterson moved toward the door, clearly eager to end the conversation. I will pray for you. That is all I can offer. The doctor refused to even open his door. They could see him watching through the window, his face blank with fear as they stood on his porch and knocked. He knows, Maggie said quietly. He has probably treated women from Blackburn's operations, seen the injuries, the abuse. Her voice hardened, and he said nothing. By evening, they had exhausted every official avenue. The mayor was out of town. The telegraph operator claimed his machine was broken. The newspaper editor listened politely, then explained that he could not print unverified accusations against such an important man. Blackburn's reach extended everywhere. His money had bought not just officials, but an entire community's willingness to look the other way. What do we do now? Rosalie asked as they stood in the growing darkness outside the general's store, their options dwindling with every passing hour. Garrett had no answer. Then a voice spoke from the shadows. You are the ones Blackburn is hunting. They spun, weapons drawn, to find an old woman watching them from the mouth of an alley. She was small and bent with age, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp despite the years that had clouded them. Who are you? Eleanor demanded. Someone who knows what that man really is. The woman stepped forward, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. My name is Martha Greer. 30 years ago, before Blackburn built his empire, he took my daughter, worked her in one of his establishments until the consumption took her. The words hung in the cold air like ghosts. I have been waiting, Martha continued, waiting for someone brave enough to stand against him, waiting for someone who might actually win. But we are not winning, Garrett said bitterly. We are barely surviving. Survival is the first step toward victory. Martha gestured toward the alley behind her. Come, I have a place where you can rest, plan, and I have information that might help you. They followed her through a maze of back streets and narrow passages, finally arriving at a small house on the outskirts of town. It was modest but clean, filled with the accumulated memories of a long life. Photographs lined the walls. A fire crackled in the hearth. And on the table, spread out like a battle map, were documents that made Eleanor gasp. Where did you get these? She picked up a ledger page, her hands trembling as she recognized the handwriting. I was a seamstress for the Blackburn household for 15 years, Martha said. After my daughter died, I stayed, watched, waited, collected what I could. Her aged face hardened with decades of suppressed rage. I know where he keeps his prisoners. I know the rotation of his guards. I know the layout of his compound better than he does. Garrett studied the crude map Martha had drawn. Blackburn's main residence was a sprawling complex on the edge of town, surrounded by walls and guarded by armed men. But there were weak points. A servant's entrance that was only lightly watched. A section of wall that had crumbled and been hastily repaired. A schedule of guard changes that left certain areas unprotected for precious minutes at a time. This could work, he said slowly. If we time it right, if we move fast enough, it is still suicide. Rosalie's voice was flat, but Garrett could see the hope flickering in her eyes. 4 of us against how many? 12 guards on night shift, Martha said. But they are not expecting trouble. They think Blackburn is untouchable. That arrogance is your greatest weapon. Eleanor moved to stand beside Garrett, her shoulder brushing against his. When do we go? Tonight. Garrett met her green eyes, seeing his own determination reflected there. We go tonight. Martha provided them with what they needed. Dark clothing, a detailed schedule of guard movements, a description of the building where prisoners were held, and most importantly, hope. As they prepared to leave, the old woman caught Garrett's arm. My daughter's name was Rebecca, she said, her voice cracking with emotion she had held back for 3 decades. She was 17 when Blackburn took her. She died at 19, coughing blood in a room without windows. Martha's grip tightened. Make him pay, for Rebecca, for all the daughters he has stolen. Garrett covered her weathered hand with his own. I will. They slipped out of Silver Creek as the moon rose over the mountains, 4 shadows moving through the darkness, toward a confrontation that would change everything. Lily was waiting, and so was Blackburn. The night swallowed them whole, and Garrett Holloway rode toward his reckoning with the man who had destroyed everything he loved. One way or another, this would end tonight. They made camp in an abandoned prospector's cabin 2 miles from Blackburn's compound. It was little more than 4 walls and a leaking roof, but it provided shelter from the wind that howled down from the peaks. Rosalie took first watch, positioning herself near the single window with her rifle across her knees. Maggie organized her medical supplies by lantern light, preparing for wounds she hoped would never come. Garrett sat in the corner, his back against the rough wooden wall, his shoulder throbbing with every heartbeat. The ride had reopened the wound and fresh blood had soaked through his bandages. He needed rest, needed time to heal. Time was the one thing they did not have. Eleanor appeared beside him, a tin cup of coffee in her hands. She had found a small stove in the cabin's corner and coaxed it back to life, filling the space with warmth that seemed almost miraculous given the cold outside. "Drink this." She pressed the cup into his good hand. "You need your strength." "I need a lot of things." Garrett accepted the coffee, letting the heat seep into his fingers. "Sleep, a new shoulder, an army." "I can only provide the coffee." Eleanor settled onto the floor beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "The rest you will have to figure out yourself." They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire. Outside, the moon had risen high over the mountains, casting silver light across the snow-covered landscape. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel given what awaited them. "Tell me something." Eleanor's voice was soft, meant only for him. "Tell me about the life you had before Sarah, before everything." Garrett considered the question. It had been so long since he thought about those days. So long since he allowed himself to remember a time when the world still held promise. "I grew up in Ohio," he said finally. "Small town. My father was a blacksmith. My mother taught school." The memories came slowly like water seeping through stone. "I was going to take over the forge, spend my life making horseshoes and fixing wagon wheels. A simple life. A good life. What changed? The war." The word carried decades of weight. "I was 18 when I enlisted. Thought I was going to save the Union and come home a hero." Garrett's laugh was bitter. "I came home something else entirely, broken in ways that did not show on the outside." Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness. "I went west because I could not stay," he continued. "Could not look at the forge without seeing the men I killed. Could not walk the streets without hearing the sounds of battle in every footstep." He paused. "Kansas was supposed to be a fresh start, and for a while it was. That is where you met Sarah, at a church social." The memory brought a ghost of a smile to Garrett's lips. "She was wearing a blue dress and she laughed at something her friends said, and I thought she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." "Was she?" "Yes." The word came out rough. "And she was kind and brave, and she believed in me when I did not believe in myself. She saw the man I could be, not the man I was." Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Garrett turned to look at her, this woman who had come to mean so much in such a short time. "You remind me of her sometimes, the way you carry yourself, the way you refuse to break no matter how hard the world pushes." Eleanor's green eyes glistened in the firelight. "I am not as strong as you think," she whispered. "Most days I am barely holding myself together, playing a part because the others need someone to believe in. That is strength." Garrett reached up with his good hand and touched her cheek, brushing away a tear she had not realized she shed. "Holding yourself together when everything is falling apart. That is the hardest kind of courage there is." They looked at each other for a long moment. The space between them seemed to shrink, filled with everything they had not said, everything they were afraid to feel. "When this is over," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible, "what do you want?" Garrett considered the question. A week ago he would have said nothing, would have said he wanted only to stop existing, to finally join Sarah and Emma in whatever peace waited beyond this life. But that was before Eagle Ridge, before 5 women who refused to surrender, before Eleanor Blackwood walked into his life and reminded him what it felt like to hope. "I want to stop running," he said finally. "I want to build something instead of just surviving. I want—" He hesitated, afraid to voice the words that pressed against his heart. I want to feel alive again, truly alive, not just waiting to die. Eleanor leaned closer. Her breath was warm against his face, her lips inches from his own. So do I, she whispered. The kiss was different from before. Not desperate, not frightened. This was something deeper. Something that spoke of possibility instead of goodbye. Her lips were soft against his, and she tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the kind of hope that defies reason. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. Whatever happens tonight, she said, I want you to know that meeting you was the best thing that has come from all of this. You gave me something I thought I had lost forever. What is that? The belief that there are still good men in the world. She smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long and terrible night. Men who fight for what is right. Men who protect those who cannot protect themselves. Men who... She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Garrett pulled her close, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, wanting only to hold her for as long as the world would allow. She fit against him perfectly, her head resting on his chest, her hand curled over his heart. I never thought I would feel this way again, he admitted. After Sarah, I thought that part of me was dead. Maybe it was. Eleanor's voice was muffled against his coat. Maybe this is something new, something different. Is that all right to feel something new? She raised her head to look at on, her green eyes holding his with an intensity that took his breath away. I think Sarah would want you to be happy. I think she would want you to live. Eleanor touched his face gently. That is what love does, Garrett. It wants the best for the people we care about, even when we are no longer there to see it. Garrett thought of his wife, her golden hair, her warm smile, the way she had always pushed him to be better than he thought he could be. Eleanor was right. Sarah would not want him to spend the rest of his life as a ghost. She would want him to fight, to love, to live. When this is over, he said, I want to take you somewhere, somewhere far from here, somewhere we can start again. Is that a promise? It is. Eleanor kissed him once more, sealing the vow between them. Then Rosalie's voice cut through the moment. Movement on the road. Someone is coming. They were on their feet in an instant, weapons drawn, the tenderness of moments before, replaced by the cold readiness of survivors. Through the window, they could see a single rider approaching, moving slowly through the darkness. But as the figure drew closer, Garrett felt his heart leap. It was Vivian, and she was not alone. Behind her, barely visible in the moonlight, rode Sheriff Daniel Hartley, and help had arrived, and with it the chance to finally end Nathaniel Blackburn's reign of terror. Tonight they would rescue Lily. Tonight justice would come to Eagle Ridge. Sheriff Daniel Hartley was a tall man in his late 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much evil to be surprised by anything. He dismounted in the cabin's small yard and extended his hand to Garrett with the grip of someone who measured men by their actions, not their words. Vivian told me everything, he said, about Blackburn, about what he has done, about the woman he is holding. You believe us. I have been investigating that bastard for 2 years. Hartley's voice was hard as granite. Watching him buy judges and bribe officials and walk free while good people suffered. I never had enough evidence to touch him. He glanced at Vivian, who stood beside a woman Garrett had not noticed before. Until now, the woman stepped forward and Garrett recognized her from Vivian's description. Silver-threaded hair, a face marked by suffering and survival. Catherine Blackburn, née Thornton, the wife who was supposed to be dead. I have testimony from 14 women, Catherine said. Her voice was quiet but steady, the voice of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Financial records showing payments to corrupt officials across 3 territories. Letters in Nathaniel's own handwriting ordering the deaths of people who threatened his operations. She paused, including a deputy sheriff's wife in Kansas. Garrett felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Here it was, the proof he had been seeking for 3 years. The answer to the question that had haunted his every waking moment. Why? The word came out raw. Why did he want Sarah dead? Catherine's eyes met his with sympathy and understanding. Your wife discovered something during her investigation. Something Nathaniel has kept hidden for 30 years. She took a breath. Nathaniel Blackburn is not his real name. He was born Nathan Burke, the son of a Confederate spy who was hanged for treason in 1865. Everything he has built, his entire fortune, began with gold his father stole from Union supply lines during the war. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Sarah had uncovered a secret that would have destroyed Blackburn's carefully constructed identity. His reputation as a self-made businessman, his position in territorial politics. His entire life was built on a foundation of lies and stolen wealth, and he had killed her to protect that lie. "We end this tonight," Garrett said, his voice cold with purpose. "We get Lily back and we bring Blackburn to justice." Hartley nodded. "I have 6 deputies, good men, loyal." He spread Martha's map across a nearby table. "Tell me what you know about his compound." The plan came together quickly. Rosalie would create a diversion at the stables, setting fire to the hay stores and scattering the horses. In the chaos, Vivian would lead a team through the servants' entrance to secure the main house. Eleanor and Garrett would descend to the cellar where prisoners were kept. Maggie would wait with a wagon at the rendezvous point ready to evacuate the wounded. Catherine would remain behind with copies of the evidence. If anything went wrong, if they failed, she would take the documents to federal authorities in Denver. Blackburn's crimes would be exposed regardless of what happened tonight. "One more thing," Hartley said as they prepared to move out. "Blackburn has at least a dozen armed men on the property. Maybe more. This is not going to be clean." It was never going to be clean. Garrett checked his revolver, ignoring the pain that shot through his wounded shoulder with every movement. "But it is going to be finished." They rode through the darkness like ghosts. Blackburn's compound loomed against the night sky, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by a stone wall. Lanterns burned at regular intervals, casting pools of yellow light that left deep shadows between them. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their breath steaming in the cold air. Garrett counted 12 men visible. There could be more inside. The signal came at midnight, a sudden bloom of orange light from the stables followed by the panicked screaming of horses. Guards shouted and ran toward the flames, their attention fixed on the growing inferno. Rosalie had done her job. Garrett moved. He slipped through the gap in the wall that Martha had described Eleanor close behind him. The servants' entrance was exactly where the old woman had said it would be, a narrow door half hidden behind a stack of empty crates. It was locked, but Vivian had provided a key, one of the many secrets she had collected during her years inside Blackburn's organization. The cellar stairs descended into darkness. Garrett went first, his revolver leading the way, his senses straining for any sign of danger. The air grew colder as they descended, thick with the smell of damp stone and something else. Something that made his stomach turn. Fear, despair, the accumulated suffering of countless women who had been held in this place. They found Lily in the 3rd cell. She was curled in the corner, her golden hair matted with blood, her face swollen and bruised. But when she saw them, when she recognized Eleanor's face in the lantern light, something sparked in her eyes, something that looked like hope. "You came." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I knew you would come." Eleanor was at her side in an instant, helping her to her feet, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to buckle. "Can you walk?" Garrett asked. Lily straightened, wincing at the pain but refusing to let it stop her. "I am not prey anymore." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "Not anymore, never again." They moved back toward the stairs, Lily leaning on Eleanor, Garrett covering their retreat. They were halfway up when the door at the top swung open, and Nathaniel Blackburn descended into the cellar. He was alone, unarmed, dressed in an expensive silk robe as if he had been roused from sleep. But there was no fear in his pale eyes, only the calm confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Mr. Holloway?" Blackburn's voice was smooth as honey. "I was wondering when you would arrive. My men spotted your little group hours ago. Did you really think a distraction at the stables would fool me?" Garrett raised his revolver. "Step aside, Blackburn. This ends now." "Does it?" Blackburn smiled, and the expression sent ice down Garrett's spine. "Before you pull that trigger, there is something you should know. Something about the lovely Miss Blackwood standing beside you. Do not listen to him." Eleanor's voice was tight with fear. "He is trying to manipulate you." "Am I?" Blackburn's pale eyes found Eleanor's and his smile widened. "Tell him, Eleanor. Tell him about Dodge City. Tell him about the night his wife came to you for help." "Eleanor," Garrett kept his gun trained on Blackburn, but his eyes flickered to the woman beside him. "I told you everything." Eleanor's voice shook. "Sarah came to me. I gave her information. I did not know Blackburn would. You knew exactly what would happen. Blackburn cut her off with a wave of his hand. You knew I had people watching the network. You knew any woman who contacted it was being tracked. And you sent Sarah Holloway straight to my men. That is not true. Is it not? Blackburn's voice dropped to a silken whisper. You were still working for me then, Eleanor. Still reporting the names of women who tried to escape. Still earning your keep by betraying the very people you claimed to help. Garrett felt the words hit him like bullets. He turned to look at Eleanor, searching her face for denial, for outrage, for anything that would prove Blackburn was lying. But what he saw was guilt. Raw, agonizing guilt that could not be hidden. It is true, she whispered. I was still under his control when Sarah came to me. I did not know he would kill her. I thought he would just frighten her, make her stop investigating. Tears streamed down her face. By the time I understood what I had done, it was too late. She was already dead. The revolver wavered in Garrett's hand. 3 years of grief and rage crashed against 3 weeks of hope and connection. The woman he had begun to love had betrayed the woman he had lost, had sent Sarah to her death, however unintentionally. Blackburn saw the hesitation and pressed his advantage. Kill her if you want. Kill them both. It makes no difference to me. He spread his hands in a gesture of false magnanimity. But ask yourself this, Mr. Holloway. If you pull that trigger, are you any different from me? The cellar fell silent except for Lily's ragged breathing and Eleanor's quiet sobs. Garrett thought of Sarah, her golden hair, her warm smile, the way she had always believed in the good in people, even when that good was buried deep. She would not want this. She would not want him to become a killer in her name. You are wrong, Blackburn. Garrett's voice was steady now, calm with a certainty that surprised even himself. I am nothing like you, because I believe in justice. Not revenge. Justice. He lowered his revolver, and then he heard the click of a hammer being cocked behind him. Sheriff Hartley stood at the top of the stairs, his deputies arrayed behind him, their weapons trained on Blackburn. Nathaniel Blackburn, Hartley said, his voice ringing through the cellar like a judge pronouncing sentence. You are under arrest for murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt a man like you knows how. Blackburn's mask finally cracked. The calm confidence shattered, replaced by something ugly and desperate. You cannot arrest me. I own the judges in this territory. I own the buck. You own nothing anymore. Catherine Blackburn descended the stairs, her silver hair gleaming in the lantern light. Hello, husband. Did you miss me? The color drained from Blackburn's face. Catherine, you are supposed to be dead. Yes, I know. You have been telling people that for years. Catherine's voice was ice. But I survived. I escaped. And I have spent every moment since then building the case that will destroy you. She held up a leather satchel bulging with documents. Every payment, every bribe, every order for murder signed in your own hand. Catherine smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had waited decades for this moment. Your empire ends tonight, Nathan Burke. And tomorrow the world will know exactly what kind of monster you really are. Blackburn lunged, not toward Catherine or the deputies, but toward Eleanor, his hand closing around her throat with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. He pulled a small pistol from his robe pocket, pressing it against her temple. Nobody moves. His voice had lost its honeyed quality, becoming something raw and ugly. Or I kill her. Garrett raised his revolver, but there was no clear shot. Eleanor's body blocked most of Blackburn's, and the pistol was pressed so close to her head that any mistake would be fatal. Let her go, Blackburn. Garrett kept his voice steady. It is over. Killing her will not change that. Maybe not, but it will hurt you. Blackburn's pale eyes met Garrett's, and there was nothing human left in them. That is all I have left now, hurting the people who took everything from me. Eleanor's green eyes found Garrett's. In them he saw fear, but also something else. Trust, faith, the belief that he would find a way to save her just as he had promised. And in that moment, Garrett made a choice. He dropped his revolver. Take me instead. He stepped forward, his hands raised. I am the one you want to hurt. I am the one who brought this all crashing down. Let Eleanor go, and you can do whatever you want to me. Blackburn hesitated. Greed and hatred warred on his face. It was all the opening Eleanor needed. She drove her elbow backward into Blackburn's ribs, twisting away from the pistol at her temple. The gun fired, but the bullet went wide, burying itself in the stone wall. Garrett lunged forward, tackling Blackburn to the ground, ignoring the agony that exploded through his wounded shoulder. They struggled on the cold stone floor. Blackburn was older, weaker, but desperation gave him strength. His hands closed around Garrett's throat, squeezing with all the fury of a man who had lost everything. Garrett's vision began to darken. Then Eleanor was there, bringing the butt of a rifle down on Blackburn's skull with a crack that echoed through the cellar. Nathaniel Blackburn collapsed and stayed down. Garrett lay on the cold stone, gasping for breath, staring up at the woman who had just saved his life. Eleanor dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside him, her hands finding his face, her tears falling on his cheeks. "I am sorry." The words poured out of her in a flood. "I am so sorry for what I did, for Sarah, for everything." Garrett reached up and touched her face. "I know." His voice was rough, his throat bruised from Blackburn's grip. "And I forgive you." Eleanor stared at him as if she could not believe what she was hearing. "How? After everything Because holding on to hate is what Blackburn did, what he wanted us to become." Garrett pulled her down to him, pressing his forehead against hers. "I choose something different. I choose to live." Around them, Sheriff Hartley's deputies secured Blackburn's unconscious form. Catherine stood watching with tears streaming down her face. Lily leaned against Maggie, who had appeared from somewhere with her medical bag. Rosalie and Vivian embraced the fierce warrior and the silent spy, finally allowing themselves to feel something other than fear. It was over. Nathaniel Blackburn's empire had fallen. And in the rubble of everything he had destroyed, something new was beginning to grow. The trial of Nathaniel Blackburn lasted 3 weeks. It was held in Denver, far from the territory he had corrupted, before a federal judge who could not be bought. The courtroom was packed, every day with journalists from as far away as New York and San Francisco, all eager to report on the downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Catherine Blackburn took the stand first. She spoke for 2 days, her voice steady, as she recounted 15 years of imprisonment, isolation, and abuse. She described the network of corruption that had allowed her husband to operate with impunity. She named names: judges, sheriffs, territorial officials, men who had looked the other way while women suffered and died. One by one, the dominoes fell. 3 judges were arrested. 2 sheriffs fled the territory before they could be taken into custody. A dozen businessmen who had profited from Blackburn's operations found themselves facing charges of their own. The empire that had seemed so permanent, so unassailable, crumbled like a house built on sand. Eleanor testified about the trafficking operations. Rosalie spoke of her father's murder and her brother's captivity. Lily, her voice barely above a whisper, described what had been done to her in Blackburn's establishments. Vivian presented the documents she had gathered during her years undercover, each page another nail in her brother-in-law's coffin. And Garrett told the jury about Sarah. He spoke of his wife's investigation, her courage, her determination to expose the truth even when it cost her everything. He spoke of the 3 years he had spent believing her death was his fault, and the moment he learned that Blackburn had ordered her murder to protect his secrets. When he finished, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. The verdict came on a cold February morning. Guilty on all counts. Murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, corruption. The judge sentenced Nathaniel Blackburn to hang, and for the first time since his arrest, the man who had terrorized an entire territory showed fear. He was executed 3 months later on a spring day when the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the mountain meadows. Garrett did not attend. He had already moved on. There were other endings, smaller ones, but no less important. Rosalie's brother Billy arrived at Eagle Ridge on a stagecoach from Philadelphia, a gangly 13-year-old who barely recognized the sister he had not seen in 2 years. They stood in the yard for a long moment, neither speaking, both afraid that words would shatter whatever fragile thing was growing between them. Then Billy smiled the same smile their father used to have, and Rosalie pulled him into an embrace that said everything words could not. "I missed you," she whispered into his hair. "Every single day. I missed you so much." "I know." Billy's voice cracked with adolescent uncertainty. "I missed you too." They spent the spring rebuilding. Rosalie taught her brother to ride again, to care for horses, to remember the skills their father had passed down before Blackburn took everything. By summer, they had acquired 3 new mares, the beginning of a breeding operation that would one day rival the one their family had lost. Lily received a letter from Kansas. Her parents had never stopped looking for her. They had sold the farm, used every penny they had to hire investigators to follow leads that went nowhere to search for a daughter they refused to believe was gone forever. When they learned she was alive, they made the journey to Colorado immediately. The reunion took place in the cabin's main room, surrounded by the women who had become Lily's second family. Her mother wept. Her father stood silent, his weathered hands trembling as he held his daughter for the first time in 3 years. "We never gave up," her mother said through her tears. "We never stopped believing we would find you." Lily smiled, and it was like watching flowers bloom after a long winter. "I know, Mama. I always knew." Her parents stayed at Eagle Ridge for a month before returning to Kansas, but they left with a promise that Lily would visit soon and that the distance between them would never feel as vast as it once had. Vivian and Catherine found their way back to each other, slowly. 15 years of separation had left scars that could not be healed overnight. There were tears and arguments and long silences, filled with everything they could not say. But there was also laughter, shared memories of a childhood spent together, the gradual rebuilding of a bond that Blackburn had tried to destroy. Catherine decided to stay in Denver, using her share of the recovered assets to establish a foundation for women escaping abusive situations. Vivian visited often, and slowly the sisters who had been torn apart began to remember what it meant to be family. Maggie opened a clinic in the valley below Eagle Ridge. It was small at first, just a single room in an old farmhouse, but word spread quickly. The doctor who had refused to help them during their darkest hour found his practice dwindling as patients sought out the woman who had spent years healing the broken and forgotten. Maggie never turned anyone away, regardless of their ability to pay. "I spent too long fixing people so they could be hurt again," she told Garrett one evening as they sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset. "Now I fix them so they can live." And Garrett and Eleanor built a life together. It happened slowly, the way all real things happen. They repaired the cabin, expanding it to accommodate the family that had formed around them. They planted a garden in the meadow where Garrett had first seen smoke rising from the chimney. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's silences, each other's wounds. On a quiet morning in late spring, Garrett climbed the hill behind the cabin to a spot overlooking the valley. He had built a small memorial there, 2 wooden crosses marking empty graves. Sarah, Emma, the wife and daughter he had lost 3 years ago. He knelt in the grass and placed wildflowers at the base of each cross. "I found something," he said quietly. "Someone. I did not expect it, did not think I deserved it." He paused, gathering words that still did not come easily. "But I think you would like her. I think you would want me to be happy." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and new growth. "I am not going to forget you, either of you, but I am going to live now, really live." Garrett touched the cross bearing Sarah's name. "That is what you would want. I know that now." He stayed for a long time, letting the peace of the mountain settle into his bones. When he finally rose and turned back toward the cabin, Eleanor was waiting for him at the bottom of the hill. She did not ask what he had been doing. She did not need to. She simply took his hand and walked beside him back to the home they were building together. That evening, Maggie found something while cleaning out a drawer in the cabin study. A letter yellowed with age tucked behind a false panel that no one had noticed before. It was addressed to Garrett, written in Silas Holloway's shaky hand. Garrett read it aloud as the others gathered around. "My dear nephew, if you have found this letter, then you have done what I hoped you would do. You have protected these women. You have brought justice to a man who deserved none. And perhaps in doing so, you have found what I could never find for myself. A family, a purpose, a reason to keep living when the world gives you every reason to stop. I am proud of you, Garrett. Prouder than I ever told you when I was alive. Take care of them. Take care of yourself. And know that wherever I am watching. With love, Uncle Silas." Eleanor squeezed Garrett's hand as he finished reading. "He knew," she said softly. "He knew we would find each other." Garrett looked around the room at the family that had formed from tragedy and survival. Rosalie and Billy arguing over whose turn it was to feed the horses. Lily humming a folk song as she prepared dinner. Vivian writing a letter to Catherine. Maggie reviewing medical texts by lamplight, and Eleanor standing beside him, her green eyes filled with a love that had grown from the ashes of everything they had lost. Yes, he said, he knew. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The cabin glowed with warmth and light and the sound of voices that had learned to laugh again. Eagle Ridge had become what Silas always intended it to be, a sanctuary, a home, a place where broken people could find their way back to wholeness. Part 9 Resolution. 1 year later, the seasons had turned full circle since Garrett Holloway first rode into the valley of Eagle Ridge. Winter had given way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, and now winter had returned, painting the mountains white once more. But everything else had changed. The cabin had grown. New rooms extended from the original structure, each one built with care and purpose. A proper stable stood where the old barn had been housing a dozen horses that bore the Brennan brand. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and the windows glowed with the warm light of a home that was truly lived in. Garrett stood on the porch watching the snow fall in gentle spirals from a gray December sky. His shoulder had healed, leaving only a scar and the occasional ache when the weather turned cold. But the deeper wounds, the ones that had nearly destroyed him, those had healed too. Slowly, imperfectly, but healed nonetheless. Behind him, the door opened and Eleanor stepped out to join him. She moved carefully now, one hand resting on the swell of her belly where their child grew. 5 months along, Maggie had said. A spring baby, a new beginning. You will catch cold out here. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter and leaned against his side. Come inside. Lily made soup. In a moment, Garrett put his arm around her, pulling her close. I was just thinking. About what? About the day I arrived here, about finding 5 women living in a cabin I thought would be empty. He smiled at the memory. About a question someone asked me. Eleanor laughed, the sound warm and rich in the cold air. Can you handle all 5 of us? She shook her head. I was terrified that day, terrified you would throw us out, terrified Blackburn would find us, terrified of everything. And now I am terrified of different things. She placed his hand on her belly, and he felt the flutter of movement beneath his palm. Like whether we have enough diapers, whether Rosalie and Billy will ever stop arguing about horses, whether Vivian will remember to visit for Christmas. Garrett turned her to face him, his gray eyes meeting her green ones. You asked me that day if I could handle all 5 of you. I thought it was a challenge, a test. He touched her face gently. I did not understand that it was an invitation. An invitation to what? To be part of something, to belong somewhere, to stop being alone. Garrett glanced back at the cabin where he could see the others moving behind the frost-covered windows. I came here to die, Eleanor. I wanted to disappear into these mountains and never come back. Instead, I found a family. Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him softly. And now, can you handle all of us now? Garrett thought about the question. About Rosalie training horses with Billy by her side. About Lily singing in the kitchen while she cooked. About Maggie riding down to her clinic every morning to heal the sick. About Vivian's letters from Denver filled with news of Catherine and the foundation they had built together. About Eleanor carrying his child standing beside him in the snow. About the life they had created from the ruins of everything Blackburn had tried to destroy. However many you bring, and he said finally, I can handle them, because we handle them together. Eleanor smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. Together, she repeated. I like the sound of that. They stood in silence for a moment longer, watching the snow fall over Eagle Ridge. Then Eleanor tugged at his hand. Come inside, Garrett. Your family is waiting. He followed her through the door into the warmth and light and laughter of the home they had built. And for the first time in 4 years, Garrett Holloway felt truly at peace. The fire crackled in the hearth. Lily's soup simmered on the stove. Rosalie and Billy argued good-naturedly about which horse was faster. Maggie read aloud from a letter Vivian had sent. And Eleanor sat beside Garrett, her hand in his, their child growing between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the mountains in a blanket of white, covering the past, covering the pain. But inside Eagle Ridge, there was only warmth, only love, only the promise of tomorrow. And that was enough. That was everything, the end. So my friend, that is where our story ends tonight. Thank you for riding alongside Garrett and Eleanor through the mountains in the darkness and the long road back to hope. I hope their journey touched something in you the way it touched something in me. Before you go, I want to ask you a question. If you have ever carried a burden too heavy to name, a grief too deep to share, what would it take for you to finally set it down? And if someone you loved was taken from you, could you find it in your heart to forgive, not for their sake, for yours? Take a deep breath, pour yourself a cup of coffee or maybe some evening tea. Think about that for a moment. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you feel something real, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from tonight. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me what you thought of Garrett's choice to forgive Eleanor even after everything. Hit that subscribe button if you want to ride with me again. Because there are more stories waiting in these mountains. More tales of courage and redemption and the stubborn human need to find connection in a world that seems determined to keep us apart. Until next time, remember this. Even in the wildest places, even after the darkest nights, people still find their way home. Take care of yourselves out there, and I will see you down the trail.